Hello, Bessel Van der Kolk. I'm happy to welcome you to this new interview with you.
Good to be with you.
I feel honored to have this opportunity and to have this very one-to-one moment because last time I saw you, there were so many people around you in Boston,
Oh, it's
and
true.
now we have you for ourselves. So
Good.
thank you. You've been, there are many, many topics that we can talk about. Of course, trauma, but also all that you've done for the trauma research, the trauma treatment. The book that you've written 10 years ago that has been ever since really best selling. And I would say it's the best of the best selling books on trauma. The Body Keeps the Score, Le Corps n'oublie rien en français, in French. And also really what you've built year after year and what we've seen. So we went in Boston for the 35th Boston Research International Conference.
Yeah.
And I was really amazed by all the people you gather and all the research that you are doing or having done or that you are following. You're always searching for new things. And that's really what your book was about, bringing maybe a new light or a new vision of trauma
Yeah, there's
and a
so much
new,
to discover, of course. We
yeah, because
know so little.
we know so little. That's what you said.
Yeah.
Why? Why don't we know more?
Because the human mind and human condition is a very difficult thing to study. Even the French haven't figured it out yet, La condition humaine. Like, we are very complex creatures and capable of great generosity and warmth and great destructiveness all at once. Yeah. And we're dealing with very complex issues about the terrible things that people do to each other and figuring out to what degree we can heal from terrible experiences. These are very complex questions. But we have learned a few things. Yeah.
So, what have you learned over the years, and why is it so important to understand trauma and focus maybe on trauma when talking about mental health?
Well, the reason why it's important to talk about trauma is that trauma causes you to perceive the world in a particular way or yourself in a particular way. And in the general public, there's a focus on the event that happened back then. But the issue is not so much that event that happened, but that whatever happens to you changes who you are. Huh? When you get beaten up by your drunken father as a kid, that becomes part of your identity, becomes part of who I am. And you will get a deep feeling inside of you. It's not logical at all, but that I must be a terrible person, otherwise my father would not be hitting me so hard. Uh, and you know that that's actually not true, but these traumas become part of you, and so you feel a sense of inadequacy and shame and anger about how the trauma makes you feel. And uh, when you get to see that these are reactions of how you get to deal with horrendous events, you get to see something that Pierre Genet uh, already pointed out 150 years ago by now, that everybody does the best they can. Genet says, uh, uh, every life is a piece of art constructed with the means at people's disposal. Huh? And that's the rich part of the trauma treatment, trauma understanding is that people do the best they can in order to survive, and sometimes to survive um, in difficult ways. They may survive by cutting themselves, or they may survive by blocking out reality, or they may survive by becoming very violent. And so people will have reactions that to outsiders go like, "Oh, that's a bad person. It's an unmotivated person." But when you get to really see what people are up against, you get to see, oh, they learned how to do that in order to survive. And when you get to see that about yourself, um, particularly under hypnosis and in psychedelic experiences and some other therapeutic techniques, you really get a sense of this is what happened to me, and that gives you options of reconstruct who you are in a way. It allows you to understand that I've dealt with this, and that has left me so depressed, so anxious, so terrified. And once you have that idea in your mind, you have options about how to deal with it. As long as I say, Floros, you are a borderline personality disorder. That means you're a bad person and you need to behave better. That's sort of much of the approach of psychiatry. Um, you should not be so messed up. Once you understand trauma, you go like, oh, you are left with a deep sense of that people are going to abandon you, that people are going to hurt you, and that becomes your orientation towards life. How can I help you to have more of a sense of predictability and clarity that people are not going to abandon you? And so you need to know the origin of things.
And so when did it come? But when did it? How did it? Maybe how did it arrive that we went from the symptoms like PTSD, what you say, borderline or bipolar disorder, even if at back in time we didn't talk about bipolar, but maniac depressive or depressive maniac, or I don't know what, depression. Um, but how did it go from the symptoms or the mental health issue to the trauma issue?
But the things that get messed up, huh? Like when I was a student, which is half a century ago, uh, did not exist yet. But there was such a thing as manic depressive illness, which was very clear actually. Uh, People in May would get high and become manicky and buy millions of dollars of property. And in October, they would go for a depressive episode where every year they try to kill themselves. That is the original manic depressive illness. Then, since that time, the definition has become broader and broader. So anybody who's sort of unstable get called bipolar. But a lot of people who are called bipolar, in fact, are people who are emotionally unstable because of trauma. And what you see is that when you deal with the trauma, that the diagnosis disappears.
And when did it, you've been a few of you that really said, okay, we have to understand trauma, understand how trauma impacts the body, but also the brain. Not only the brain, but the body too.
Yeah.
And that was quite new, and and in France, it's still new. When you talk about trauma, more and more people talk about it, but we still are, like entangled in that. Um, in psychoanalysis and just talk and talk and talk, and it's kind of new, and we need to do it, and you've done that, what you've done in the United States and around the world. We have to do that in France, I would say. Not completely, but more and more people are interested into that, but not enough.
Yeah. Well, as you know, uh, because you know the book, what's so ironic to me is that uh, France is really the birthplace of trauma. It really started on the Salpêtrière, where Charcot, after the Commune, after 1870, was a big issue in France whether France was going to be a monarchy, whether church was going to be powerful, or whether it was going to be a republic. And what's ironic is that this whole study started with Charcot being such a staunch Republican and saying the future of France depends upon women. And women will either belong to science or they will belong to the church. And if they belong to the church, we'll continue to be a monarchy and a patriarchal society. But if women belong to science, we can have a truly democratic society. So interesting origin how it started. And it's also interesting that despite these very promising beginnings in France, France is one of the have the civilized countries that has among the worst track records in understanding uh, uh, trauma, and that Jung and Freud are much more honored than these fantastic Frenchmen who actually were our teachers. It's ironic for me. Yeah.
Mhm. And I heard you say that, like, for example, developmental trauma is a hidden epidemic. Why is it hidden? You wrote that in the book. It's
Yeah.
one chapter of the book.
Well, trauma is hidden because um, something happens. Let's say a very common thing: you grow up in a household, let's say, with an alcoholic, violent parent, and that becomes your world. And so that becomes the environment in which your mind and your brain matures. And so you get a mind that says, somebody can be very nice one moment, but the next moment they'll become very angry and they'll beat you up. And so you never know if people are going to beat you up. And that will create a person who is always suspicious and always ready for bad things to happen. And a person who will probably not be very open to other people because their life experience is somebody can get drunk at any time and hurt you. So I'm going to stay rigidly in control over myself and I won't let anybody get to hurt me. And that, of course, makes it very difficult to have an intimate relationship with somebody, to really have open dialogues with people. And that so that affects the way you relate to other people. So, but people don't say, oh, I have trouble with intimacy because my dad used to beat me up when I was a child. No, it usually starts like my wife is not very nice to me, and that's why it's hard for me to have a warm relationship with her. And we make up our meaning making system, and what the element of trauma does that is actually that there's something in you that is set in a way that gets in the way of your having the best life you can have, and that you need to really probe what your habitual reactions are to closeness or disagreement, etc., etc.
So it's also going from it's my fault or it's the other one's fault to something happened to me, and this is the origin of my difficulties or my problems, and maybe there's an issue, there's a way out of that.
Right. And so the first thing is indeed, and that's where psychoanalysis does come in handy, is to be able to find words for your experience and to really become aware that I meet this person and I like this person a lot, but before too long I get very critical, and I find myself having barriers against getting close to this person, and then usually people externalize their problems and say it's because of that person. But after 3 or 4 relationships like that, you start thinking, maybe there's something about me that gets in the way. And then uh, you you go to therapy, you really get to understand and feel what your reactions are, and how your body freezes and how you get restless and anxious under certain conditions. And so the first order of business is to really get to know yourself and to be curious about yourself. Huh? And uh, one thing that makes it difficult is that in psychiatry, we like to give people labels, and the labels that we give people tend to be very derogatory. So you call somebody a borderline, or you call somebody something like that, and that means you're a bad person. And we don't really uh, diagnose people in the first place like you have trouble getting close to people, you have problem feeling safe with people, uh, and so but the trauma perspective really helps you with is that we are a troubled species, and people have always had trouble, and that doesn't mean that you're necessarily bad. It means that you have certain reactions, um, reactions to your environment that gets in the way of you having a fulfilling life. And to really understand yourself, what is it about your reactions that get in the way, and how I can change those reactions. Yeah.
But if we come back to the impact of trauma in the body, in the brain, what happens? What makes it so difficult sometimes to get out of that? Because when we talk about it, we understand, okay, my dad did that, or my
Yeah.
mom did that, or I was abandoned, or I lost my mom or when I was 15, or knowing that, like, I can relate to that. My mom knew that she had lost her mom. She was 15, but it never helped with her bipolar disorder. It
Right.
never helped her be okay. Because why is that?
So
What happens?
and that's where the neuroscience piece really came in helpful. Huh? And I think everything else that we came up with was more or less said by various people over the past 150 years. But a new perspective was that we were able to look into what happens in people's brains. Um, uh, and what we found there is basically that the organization of your brain, your perceptions, the way that your brain takes in the world is not in a rational part of the brain. It's your survival brain, or as Antonio Damasio calls it, uh, the part of your brain has to do with housekeeping of the body. Huh? And so much of our brain is geared towards just helping us to be alive and to see the world in a basic way without much consciousness. And then the conscious part of our brain helps us to make meaning out of our reactions. But our reactions are automatic reactions. They're physical reactions. They're led by hormones and neuronal pathways. Um, so you make meaning out of that. And now you may be able to make meaning out of your experiences like, oh, I continue to be really scared that people would get too much power over me and I push them away. Uh, I don't like to do that. And then the question becomes, how can I soften myself up to be more trustful of other people? And then you need to do something specifically that addresses this issue. So I would say that something like psychodrama might be very helpful for you to really feel your reactions to other people. What we found in our psychedelic research is that in psychedelic research, people oftentimes have very clear memories of uh, old things that happened to them that were very painful. And there is something about MDMA in particularly that allows you to go and visit that old trauma and to visit yourself back there and say, yeah, this really happened to me. And you go like, this poor kid, he was always so scared. He was always afraid to be humiliated. And once you get a deep sense of this happened to me, you start having a sense of compassion for yourself, and you start actually feeling like, I'm so sorry this happened to you back then because it made your life so hard. But the judgment doesn't come from somebody else, it comes from yourself, who's able to say, wow, I was just a little kid and I was so scared, and there's nothing I could do to change the situation. So you get to, if you can really go deep into yourself, and the old Frenchman used to use hypnosis for that. I'm still really curious about hypnosis and to what degree hypnosis can accomplish some of the same things as we do with our other current methods. Hypnosis is not very popular these days, probably not even in France. Um, but uh, but the trick is to go into a state of consciousness where you can very deeply feel yourself and experience yourself on a very profound way, but also know that your brain stays in a state where you know the difference between the past and the present. And that's a critical thing is that when you're married and you have a habitual defensive reaction with your spouse, you say it's because of my spouse. Uh, and once you get into yourself, you go, oh, that old feeling keeps coming back inside of me, having to do with how I was hurt as a child. Yeah.
But many people, when they come to therapy, they often say, "I know what happened. I don't want to go back there." Um, what have you found is most effective, or how can we react to those people saying, "I don't want to go back there because I don't want to live that again or relive
Right.
that"?
And I would say absolutely, and you don't have to. All we have to do is become aware of what happens to you right now. So when I'm 5 minutes late for an appointment, um, what's your reaction? What do you feel in your body? Uh, well, I felt like killing you when you were 5 minutes late. I said, wow, isn't that interesting? Where did you feel that in your body that you wanted to kill me? And then you go like, where else have you felt this way before? But it's usually via people's internal experience, not by storytelling so much, but by really experiencing your own reactions very deeply and feeling them very deeply. But it's not about storytelling. It's really about becoming aware of who you are and what your habitual reactions are. Yeah.
And you've been very, you're talking about curiosity. You're someone who is really curious about everything. You've been searching and searching, and you, even still now, you're still searching new things or new ways to heal trauma or to help people that are struggling with trauma. What are the main, maybe the main turning points that you've seen in those many years that you've worked around trauma?
So I've lived in a particular slice of time, and we all get very determined by the time that we live in. When I read the guys at the Salpêtrière from the 1880s, they saw the world in a different way than we do today. And so, where did we come from? We came from a world of psychoanalysis, that's in America also, and to understand and to have a developmental point of view. And we come from a world of language. And then one of the first things you see when you work with traumatized people is how they do things, and they have reactions. And there's very little language for that. They automatically have feelings and emotions. And then one of my earliest pieces of research that for me was very important is to really see how when you're traumatized, your emotions run the show. And then later on, I learned that Genet actually saw the same thing back in 1889 already, had that your emotions run the show. When you're not traumatized, you can use your reason, but when you're traumatized and your emotion gets stirred up, your anger, your fear, your rage is what runs the show. And you get to see that. And so that was the first order of business. It's about reactions. And then the next piece that we saw is that the past keeps coming back, not as a story, but as a reaction. And for me, the first really window of opening up therapeutic possibilities was through EMDR, of all things. And EMDR is a very strange method. You ask people to bring certain things to mind, and as they do that, you ask people to follow your fingers as you move your fingers from side to side in front of people's eyes. It's a very strange method, and anybody in his right mind goes like, "How can you do something as stupid as that?" Because wiggling your fingers in front of people's eyes doesn't make any sense. Uh, but when we started to do it, it turns out that oftentimes this helped people to integrate a memory and to go like, "Yeah, ordinarily, when I start feeling it, all these feelings start coming back. But now, when I do the EMDR, I can remember what happened to me back then, but it belongs to the past and it doesn't belong to the present." And so that really got me really intrigued is that there are certain things we can do to change your internal sense of time, which has nothing with understanding. It has something to do with activating new neural circuits. And then the advances in neuroscience became very helpful because we were able to take pictures, fMRI pictures of people's brains when they go through a neurofeedback. And we saw that certain circuits in the brain got activated that allow people to know the difference between the past and the present. Nothing to do with reason. We just activated different neural circuits. Huh? And up to now in psychology, people have always said you need to figure it out and talk about it. And what EMDR really showed me, no, you can do things to change the way that your brain perceives the world. And for me, EMDR was the opening up into that world, a very strange method that allowed us to see that certain things sort of change your relationship. And another very important experience I had is I was an advisor to the Truth Commission in South Africa in 1994, 1996. And I traveled around with Bishop Tutu, whose job it was to prevent a massacre from occurring when South Africa was turned over to the ANC. Um, and there was a lot of reason to fear that terrible things would happen, like happened in India at the independence, because there was so much pent up rage that people had. And the whole purpose of the Truth Commission is to give people a sense of kindness and safety. And Tutu was extremely good at that. And what did I see him do with people? He would dance with people, and he would sing with people. And you saw people just becoming quiet. So that's interesting. Moving together, dancing together, making music together is a very, around the world, except more in the US and Northwestern Europe and every other part of the world, people make music and they dance to deal with trauma. And it happens to be not part of our culture. But for me, that was a very important insight to see how being in tune with people, being physically in harmony with people on a somatic level, really restored a sense of safety. And so I've always been very intrigued with things like tango dancing, how tango dancing can be enormously beneficial for people to just to learn to move with somebody else and have your body be in tune with other people. I think playing music together is one of the healthiest things we can do because our bodies and our biology gets in sync with other bodies and other biology. It's experiences like that that got me to move away from that core psychoanalytic point of view that you need to talk about it and understand it into no, you need to have experiences that correct that sense of isolation and of being separated from your environment.
So what you're saying is maybe the EMDR brought something more with the brain, and then what you understood when you went to this and see the work of Tutu is more like dancing those so the body work on the body, but also the togetherness,
Right. But
because
see,
psychotherapy was about one to one or one only. Even in psychoanalysis, you're alone. You have someone in your back and you don't even
I mean,
see, so there's no relationship.
right. Um,
And so
right.
this is really something, this this is bringing something new.
Yeah, nothing is new. Somebody in China or India or Australia invented it before we did it. These things are never entirely new. But, um, uh, but, but really came out and important influences were the work of the attachment researchers like John Bowlby and Mary Main and my friend Ed Tronick and the other attachment researchers that I hang out with. Had they really showed that at the core of who we are is our relationship with our caregivers, how safe we feel with our caregivers, how well seen we are, and that we basically become the people who we are by an attuned understanding for the people in our environments. And so, if a family, if you cook together, if you make music together, if you make beds together, if you farm together, your body is part of a community of bodies that create something. Uh, and then, of course, in psychology, that dimension has been lost. And the dimension of how in tune we are together uh, is not so important. In my own psychoanalysis, it was very not a good experience at all. And after 2.5 years, I set up and said, guys, this is much a waste of money, waste of time. I don't want to do it anymore. I set up And I looked at my psychoanalyst and I said, you know, you have a very kind face. If I'd been able to see your face while I was talking about um, growing up during the Second World War in Holland and how terrifying it was, how terrifying my parents were, how terrifying it was people in concentration camps. Uh, if I'd seen your face, I would have been completely different. But because you sat there, I felt as lonely and as isolated as I always felt. Yeah. Uh,
And so you went out of that and you went to where did you go after
well,
psychoanalysis
no,
as a person,
well, but
or what
you know,
helped you the most in your own trauma journey?
what you do is, you're a doctor, you have a degree, and you hang out with other people who become fellow travelers. And so I've always had uh, very close friends and colleagues who, with whom you go on a journey of exploration. Judy Herman was one of my earlier ones, Onno van der Hart, and quite a lot of other people, and you start discovering things together. And so uh, you explore things as a group, uh, and and you try it on yourself. And so in 1994, I got to know body workers. And I was supposed to be the mainstream speaker talking about neuroscience as a body oriented conference. And I met Pat Ogden there and Peter Levine and other people whose names you probably don't know. And I saw how they much more embodied they are, how the way they walk, the way they stood, the way they interacted with each other had a much more vital dimension to it. And so I worked with them, I studied them, we looked at things together, and we made videotapes of our body work, and we looked at it together and say, what's going on here? But it's always a very social thing. It's always, you find other people who share your curiosity, and then you go on a journey of exploration. And so the body work was very important. For me personally, the body work was very important because I was born in 1943. A lot of kids of my generation died of starvation. I was a very sickly child. And I think I always lived in a body of a boy who had been a sickly child. And then I did the body work, and that changed the way that I experienced my body. And I became a much more embodied person who felt much more power in his body than I'd always felt. So that was an important dimension for me, may not be an important dimension for you, you know. And so what happens to help me doesn't necessarily help you. And that is part of my scientific training, is we don't only talk about our successes, we talk about our failures. Huh? And so the central part of our center, our clinic, always was the morbidity and mortality conference, where we looked at our treatment failures and we try to learn from, why didn't it work? EMDR worked with that other person, didn't work with this person, or the psychodrama worked with that person and not with this person. So we needed to be very precise to figure out why certain things did not work for people. And that's not the culture that we live in. The culture that we live in is we like to talk about our successes and ignore that didn't work for the other half of the people. And so that's what kept me going. So there were many methods that I learned were very helpful. Like, I did the first study on yoga and trauma. Yoga was a very good treatment uh, for many traumatized people, not for everybody. And they go like, that's so strange, putting your butt in the air, twisting your body into a pretzel, helpful for trauma. And it turned out, indeed, that's the case, because yoga changes certain structures in your brain that allows you to be much more self-aware and much more caring about your own body, actually. So that is an important dimension. So it has always been actually one dimension after another. But it's go like, that's interesting. Here's another aspect, and there's another aspect. And of course, the last few years, it has been very much about exploring psychedelic agents, which is the hot new topic in the world we live in. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about psychedelics because it's really a topic today nowadays in trauma treatment. It's very experimental.
Yeah,
It's only the research phase. It's not
it's pretty good research.
accessible for everyone.
Yeah,
Um, so you've done some research. You've
more than some. We got a prize
one of
for
some.
one of the 10 best scientific papers in the world. Like, it was not like a little bit. Like, yeah. So it's a very serious enterprise. Like, yeah.
Yeah. So, what does the psychedelics bring to the trauma world, to the
Well,
trauma treatment?
the reason why I got interested in psychedelics is, of course, I'm a child of the 60s, growing up in America during that time, and we did LSD. And, uh, and quite a few of my colleagues have become very eminent scientists. And I would say to my friends, you know, did you take LSD in college? He said, of course I did. Um, uh, they asked him, what effect do you think LSD had on your growth as a person, as a scientist? And they said, I think it made all the difference because on LSD, I became aware that the reality that I live in is only a very small part of the overall reality that there is. And that always intrigued me because when you're traumatized, you also live in a very constricted reality. Your fear, your anger, your rage is oftentimes all there is. There's not much room for anything else. So I was, I shared Vic Doblin, Michael Mithoffers, uh, Phil Wolfson, and some of my colleagues there shared their interest like, can we open up people's minds by giving them uh, psychedelic experiences to really have them experience how much larger the world is than the world they get trapped in. And that's indeed what we found is that psychedelics really allow people to see other pieces of reality and of other experiences that go very deep and very, very core of your being, where you go like, oh, I didn't know the world was so gigantic or so integrated, or um, uh, have another perspective on yourself. And that's indeed very much what we saw in our psychedelic treatment is that afterwards people see themselves in a much larger context. They can have much more perspective on themselves. They have much more understanding and much more compassion for themselves on psychedelics. Psychedelics really open up people's minds to realities that they did not know existed before. Yeah.
And so, when we're talking about psychedelics, what kind of psychedelics
Well,
are used?
the psychedelics we studied in our research is MDMA, which is very likely to become legal this year in America because of our research. Uh, uh, Vic Doblin, who you met at my conference,
When you say our research, what do you mean? Who is doing the research?
um, we did. So an organization called the Multidisciplinary uh, Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS. That's Vic Doblin's organization. So Rick collected $63 million to do this study. So I wouldn't call that some research. I mean, that's a very large, very serious study. Um, we had 13 sites around the US, a site in Holland, a site in Israel, and I ran the Boston site. So I ran one of the sites, and I was in charge of some of the data analysis. And so it was a very large study, and our results were really extraordinary. Uh, Extraordinarily good outcome with a very disturbed population, actually. These were people who um, had grew up in very violent environments, usually, who had never felt safe with anybody, who had no memory of oftentimes of feeling safe with any particular person. So they were very, very, very not firmly rooted in this world, oftentimes very much run by anxiety and depression and being out of touch. And on MDMA, they got a much deeper sense of this is who I am, this is what I've gone through, This is what my experiences mean to me. And they ended up with a very deep sense of self understanding and self compassion. That was really very dramatic, actually. Yeah. Uh,
How does a MDMA session um, how long? Because I've heard that it's quite long. The effect of the MDMA is quite long, so this is very long sessions.
well, not very long. So,
Could you describe it a little bit for
so
people who don't really know how it
all these
works?
different drugs have different lengths of time. And so MDMA is about 6 hours. Ketamine is only an hour and a half. 5 a.m. EMT is only half an hour. Ibogaine is 3 days. Ayahuasca is a very long time. So you have different molecules that have slightly different effects. But on MDMA, which is going to be probably the standard for a while, um, you get to know people quite well. You spend about 8 hours together to really get to know somebody, to learn to trust the people who sit with you. And then one day you come in, you have two therapists, you put a blindfold over your eyes, and you play music. Um, and you go deep inside. And then as you go deep inside, your psychedelic world starts opening up. Um, Oftentimes, it's not very pleasant. Oftentimes, very painful memories come up. Um, Sometimes feelings of bliss come up, but it's not the most predominant thing. And you go deep inside and you feel things about yourself and experience things about yourself that you really are oftentimes not aware of. Things become clearer about you. Um, and then uh, you talk some with your therapist. But the more important thing is that after the experience is over, you spend some time after the experience to process what came up, what your dreams are like, uh, what thoughts have come up, what things of your past have come up. So it's really, these are mind opening experiences. And in our study, we had decided to have 3 one whole day sessions. Um, some people were fine after 2 sessions, and some people after 3 sessions said, I wish I could have done some more. Yeah, but when you do a study, you have a protocol and you stay by the protocol. In reality, I think uh, it's likely. I use it in my practice also. I don't use MDMA, but I use ketamine in the US. That is legal, actually. And I would have people come in who do psychotherapy with me. They come in once a week or something like that. And about once a month or once every 6 weeks, we have a ketamine session where they go very deep and they unearth all kind of other stuff. And then you spend the next month or so talking about what came up.
And have you experienced it yourself? Do you is it important that the therapists who are doing the sessions have experienced that
Very good
themselves?
question. Somebody just said, would you fly with a pilot who has only read books about flying? Or would you learn how to fly a plane from somebody who's flown a plane themselves? No, you need to have the experiences yourself to really also be surprised by yourself. If there's one thing about psychedelics, it brings up stuff that you did not know was there. And sometimes there may be extraordinary visions of world peace and harmony, and sometimes they can be terrifying experiences where you go through what the book of Job in the Bible goes through, where everything looks desperate, etc., etc. So you have a lot of deep experiences, but that relationship that you have with the people who are your guide is very important. And the thing that I'm most worried about as these drugs are about to become legalized is that people take shortcuts in terms of the therapeutic experience. They will not really focus on the importance of processing, being with somebody, feeling somebody is there for you, having somebody really know you very well. That's a very important part of it. And they need to have gone through it themselves and be surprised at themselves. Yeah.
And how can we prevent that? Because in fact, it can be like if people take that, if it's legalized, and what I heard is that it might become legal in the US.
Yeah,
I'm not sure about Europe.
it's
I
legal in
think it will
Australia.
come.
Yeah, but
Sorry,
In Australia, it's legal, for example.
it's in Australia, it's
Yeah,
legal,
they use
but
Irish,
not in Europe.
and I think
But
In Holland is very close also. Yeah,
mhm. And people are going to go into that
yeah,
like it's a miracle.
yeah.
How can we prevent that?
Well, luckily, I'm not a policeman, uh, and people will do foolish things, and people will do stupid things. All I can do is that some people listen to me sometimes, and I say, "Don't do it by yourself. Uh, uh, don't give these drugs to people unless you're there with them, and you really get to know them very well." And I'm sure that we'll hear bad stories about where things have gone wrong for people.
Aren't you afraid that like something like what happened with Oxycontin,
Oh,
Oxy,
that's
sorry, Oxy,
uh, um, I know.
where
I,
people,
yeah,
like they used it, they
yeah,
turned around and used it for themselves.
yeah. I don't think it will be like OxyContin because these things they require too much from you. Uh, these are not drugs that make you blissed out and not feel anything. They make you feel things. So, but I'm sure that people will do bad things to them because people do. People always do. Uh, and all we can do is to warn people and uh, use my voice of experience to say, uh, no, don't take it by yourself. But it's already happening in America. You can order ketamine by mail, uh, horrendous doses, and I know people who are very unstable, people who just got sent ketamine in the mail and who took it. Uh, I think it's a terrible thing to do. It's totally wrong, but bad things will happen.
Because coming back to what you said at the very beginning, and what you're saying now, it's that you should not do it by yourself,
Right.
because trauma is also a question of not being alone with something. So
Well,
being in relationship,
see,
finding a safe relationship with someone.
so the nature of trauma is that you're by yourself. Huh? The word I used in my previous book a lot is God forsaken. It's a good French word for that. Dieu abandonné, something. But God forsaken is a very deep feeling, and that's the feeling of trauma. There's nobody there for you. You're all by yourself, and so if you go through psychedelic experiences and stuff comes up that's really terrifying, and there's nobody with you who really understands you, is there with you, it can be very damaging. Yeah.
And do you think because you've seen really incredible results with the psychedelics and the MDMA in the MDMA research, do you think it's a long lasting? Is it like permanent? Like when you rewire a brain this way, will it last? Do you have any? Uh,
Yeah.
how do you say recul on that in French?
Reculer pour mieux sauter. Uh, 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 yes. See, let's say once you have seen Paris, you don't forget what Paris looks like. Once you have gone, once you know what it's like to lie on the beach of the Côte d'Azur, that experience doesn't go away. And so it becomes part of you. It doesn't mean it solves all of your problems, but it is a lasting experience of being confronted with uh, very large realities that you ordinarily don't know about it. And once you have had a deep mystical experiences, you don't forget it.
There are two other things I would like to talk with you about to really like try to cover everything that, not everything, but a large part of what you've done. One thing is that you talk a lot about neurofeedback.
Yeah.
Um, what is that, and why is it important to maybe add that to a trauma treatment?
Yeah. Neurofeedback, to my mind, is the most underrated treatment. huh? And that is that about 30 years ago by now, a guy by the name of Barry Sturman um, was given the task by NASA, the aerospace um, organization, the government, because they had sent cats into space, and these cats had gotten seizures from being exposed to rocket fuel on their space travel. And so they asked this guy, can you do something to help these cats to stop having convulsions all the time? So he learned that he can give input to these cats' brains that help them to create brain waves that are steady and that um, don't produce convulsions. And that gave rise to say, maybe you can do it for people too. And so now that we know quite a bit about the brain. We have a lot more to learn, but so uh, we can actually take measurements of people's brain waves. You can really see, particularly the more traumatized you are, that how your brain is not really doing very well at all. That you have abnormal rhythms and normal connectivity, and you cannot really change those brain rhythms by talking, insight, or understanding. And what Barry Sturman and other people then found out is that if you can play computer games with your own brain and you can harvest the brain waves that you generate, and you can play then a game with your own brainwaves so that your brain gets rewarded for creating configurations of neuronal circuits that helps you become more focused and more calm. So we can actually change the brain, the way the brain functions, by giving people inputs on a sensory level, basically. So this is a true alternative to psychopharmacology. I started off life as a psychopharmacologist. I did the very first studies on Prozac and Zola for PTSD. They weren't bad, they weren't great either, but we thought that chemicals would be able to permanently change people's pathology. The world was a very hopeful place back then, and it hasn't worked out very well at all. Psychiatric drugs make a little bit of a difference, but they don't really cure people. They don't really reset people. And what we found out in neurofeedback that you can actually train the brain to be more focused and more calm, and to be more efficient, basically. Um, and so when you were at our conference, you heard some talks about neurofeedback, and we actually are very active in promoting neurofeedback as a way of really making your brain work for you. An example I like to give in my book is that the Italian soccer team, the Azzurros, um, started to do neurofeedback for optimal performance, and that year the Italians won the world championship. The Canadian ski team did neurofeedback, and they helped their brains to just be a little bit more focused and more precise. And the Canadian ski team won all the gold medals. And so I think the idea of approaching people from an optimal functioning point of view, to my mind, is a very sympathetic way of looking at people. How can we help you to function optimally? How can we help your brain to work best for you so that you can be really good at what you're doing and your kids also love you?
And why is that? What's the link between neurofeedback and trauma?
Uh, so when you're traumatized, you live in a internally very confused and confusing world. When you're really traumatized, you oftentimes really don't know what's going on. You're out of touch with what's happening much of the time. Uh, you cannot pay attention. Your fear takes over, your anger takes over. And when you calm that whole system down, you can have a much better understanding of, oh, this is what's happening. And you can make much more appropriate plans of how to react to what's happening in your environment. If you live with a traumatized brain, you're more likely to become extremely upset or extremely angry, be carried away by your emotions, or not to feel anything at all. And so you cannot respond appropriately to your environment. But if you train that brain, you can help the brain to work for you to be more more precise and more understanding about what's happening. Yeah.
The other thing I would like to talk about with you is the Trauma Research Foundation. You've created a foundation. Could you tell us a little bit about the story of this foundation, why you did that, and what's the goal of it?
Well, what happened is that 40 years ago, I started the trauma center, and it's really a collection of people who were working together on what's the best treatment. We did a lot of different studies: yoga, EMDR, theater, various child interventions, and that was really who we were. And at some point, I took time off to write my book, The Body Keeps the Score, and I wasn't there for a while. And I had turned the clinic over to younger people. And the main person I turned the clinic over was doing bad things to students. And that was discovered. And so the whole center fell apart. I came back from my sabbatical and it was a mess. And then the clinic was closed as a result of that. But in the meantime, we had all this knowledge, all this research, and all these connections that we have. And so we decided to uh, continue our work uh, to to promote people to be curious about optimal treatments. And so, what we were also impressed with is that in traditional psychiatry and psychology, psychologists yak and psychiatrists give people pills, and that there is very little creative stuff. And then, in part because of my travels to other parts of the world, uh, um, for example, I've been to China quite a few times, and in China, a lot of people do qigong and tai chi, and you go like, that's interesting. That really seems to help people to function better. But in the US, you don't study Tai Chi or Qigong. So I say, let's go study Tai Chi and Qigong. And for example, I'm very interested in Brazil. Uh, Kids, poor and traumatized kids, practice capoeira, and you see these kids learning how to do martial arts. You go like, wow, that capoeira seems to really do something to organize their brains, organize their behavior, and this is not just fun and games, but they really organize their body. That is very far away from our Western European way of understanding psychopathology. And so if somebody uh, comes around and says, I would like to study capoeira as a treatment for trauma, I say, we'll work with you and we'll see if we can get you money to study that because we're really interested in promoting innovative type treatments.
So that's really the goal of the foundation.
The goal for Foundation is to get money for all the things that I wanted to get money for and never was able to. For example, I told you earlier, I got very much into body-oriented therapies, very important to us. Our next book is about body-oriented therapies, actually, um, and uh, then I discovered that the issue of touch has barely ever been studied. We have studied vision, we have studied audition, we have studied smell, but human touch has barely been studied. When you're traumatized, your touch system is probably messed up. And so we spent a lot of money funding studies on what can touch do for people to help them feel better because it was a missing dimension. Yeah.
And so you're talking about your next book. Could you tell us a little bit
Yeah.
more about it?
Well, so the next book
I'm curious.
it started off as a workbook for The Body Keeps the Score. In the meantime, there's about 15 other people who have written workbook for The Body Keeps the Score. But our book is called Come to Your Senses, and that's how our sensory world really determines who we are and how we see the world, and that you actually need to work with your sensory experiences to change how you experience yourself and how you deal with the world. So we talk about touch, we talk about movement, we talk about neurofeedback, we talk about psychedelics as always of changing that core relationship to your internal experience, basically. Uh, um, this day in our culture, maybe in France also, there's a lot of talk about, oh, poverty does terrible things for people, or Let's change, make society more just, or sorry, there's less trauma. We have never been very good in making society a better society. That's what psychiatrists are not good at. So I say, no, our job is not to make the world a better place. Our job is to provide people with better treatments. Not that the world shouldn't be a better place, but we don't have any expertise in that. So,
And so you're writing the book with Licia,
with
Licia
Licia,
Sky.
yeah, it's almost finished.
It's almost finished, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to
Yeah,
translate it in French
great.
sooner or later, as soon as possible, of course, because I think people are really waiting for some new stuff from you.
Yeah, but but I'm also impressed with. There's already a lot of old stuff that most people don't know about. That was for us our discovery of the Salpêtrière was really very profound. Uh, and to read that these guys who have been dead for a long time, whose names people hardly remember, were filled with wisdom and filled with understanding. So it's not only new stuff; it's also keeping old stuff that people already knew, keep it alive. Yeah.
Before we end our conversation, what would you like to tell people that you've learned over the years, or what do you want to tell new new psychiatrist or new psychologist or new psychotherapist or new body workers or all the people that are dealing with trauma for others? And also, what do you want to say to people who are struggling with their own traumas? What other message you want to pass on?
That's well, I'd say.
It's a large question. You can take the time you want.
Like, uh, uh, first of all, I think in order to be helpful to other people, you need to work with yourself. Huh? And certainly when I was trained, you were expected to get your own therapeutic experience. And uh, I think you start off being very curious about yourself and how do you get to be who you are, uh, what works, what doesn't work. And really, Socrates, notice the outcome, know yourself, first of all. And get to see how this creature functions and get to know some other people really very well. And then learn how you can calm the system down and discover what's on. Does music work for you? Does breathing differently do for you? What does movement do for you? What does dancing do to you? And to really discover how these things change you. But one of the things that I'm very active in advocating in the US is that every school teaches kids all the time the 4 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and self regulation. And that from very early on, kids get taught how their bodies work, how their emotions work, how their minds work, and how making music together changes things, how playing basketball together changes things, how sitting still changes things, so that you become a subject of interest to yourself. And I'm actually sort of puzzled that school systems don't do that. It's always, let's learn about Columbus discovering America. How about learning about Bessel discovering about Bessel? Florence discovering Florence. Yeah, yeah.
So be curious with yourself
Oh, very much so. Yeah, very much.
and don't wait for a miracle or a miraculous treatment. Everybody doesn't react. What you said, everybody doesn't
Yeah,
react the same way
but
to
yes and no.
some treatments. Yeah.
Well, because when you discover one of these new things, like for me, EMDR and neurofeedback, you go like, wow, I did not know this was possible. Yeah? So there, and I hear all the time from people who have invented something else. I don't know all the things that people invented. I can't know it all. But yes, it's very important to also say what I'm doing here is not working, and then to go what else is working. And a major issue in our field is that therapists tend to be very religious people. They have studied Freud and now they're Freudians. They've studied EMDR and now they're EMDR therapists. No, you have read a few books by a guy called Sigmund Freud that may have been somewhat helpful to you. What else is there? What else is there? Not like I'm a Jungian. They're like, tell your friends about it on Saturday night. How are you going to make this person better? That's our job, and not your religious affiliation. And Jung may have been helpful for you, but he didn't have all the answers. Yeah.
Well, thank you very, very much for this very, very passionate conversation. We have the two in French and English.
Yeah.
So for people who are listening to us, if you don't know this book, you have to get it and read it and or listen to it or whatever works for you. You don't have to read it in one piece, but you can read it little by little,
Very slowly.
and something will certainly talk to you, and you will certainly learn something about yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Florent.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bessel. That was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.